No. Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to today's seminar on the freight question. My name is Ben Plowden. I am the chair of the Transport Planning Society, and it's my privilege to be chairing today's webinar. The Transport Planning Society, for those of you that don't know, is a professional body whose aims are to represent the interest of transport planners, to support their professional development through our skills program, and to work to influence decision making both nationally, regionally, and locally in the service of a more sustainable transport system, and connecting that transport system to other systems such as the land use planning system, health, the environment, and so on. It's a real pleasure to be chairing today's webinar because in a former incarnation, I was responsible for freight at Transport for London, where I worked with Ian Wainwright, who I'm going to introduce in a minute. I once met a senior design engineer from Volvo Trucks when I was working with colleagues at TfL on developing the direct vision standard for construction lorries. And he said in a workshop that freight is like blood. It's something that everybody needs and nobody wants to see, which I thought was a really interesting metaphor for the way that freight is treated. And it seems to me to be the case that decision makers at best often underestimate the significance of freight in our lives, and at worst sometimes completely ignore it in their decision making, in their planning, in their investment decisions. And of course, all of us, whatever we do, rely on the freight and servicing sector, whether it's a big HGV delivering groceries to a supermarket, an Amazon van delivering our must-have electronic item, or somebody turning up in a van to fix our plumbing. So to help us unpack the kind of paradox whereby freight is so important and yet we generally don't take it seriously enough, we have two speakers who can help us do that with really great effect. The first is Ian Wainwright, who I mentioned a minute ago, who's the director of the Future City Logistics, a consultancy. Ian is a town planner by background, spent nearly 20 years in the logistics industry, and then another 10 or 11 years working at Transport for London, as I mentioned, with me for a while, where, amongst other things, he was responsible for the 2012 Olympics freight program, which was designed to move regular freight deliveries outside the peak hours to make sure that, as Peter Henley famously said, there's bread in the shops, blood in the hospitals, and beer in the pubs, without interrupting the Olympics strategic road network. He now runs Future City Logistics, an independent consultancy that works on a whole variety of issues to do with freight and logistics, and works with cities, businesses, operators, and academics. So Ian is going to speak first, and then he'll be followed by Fiona Jenkins, who's an associate with Steer, the consultancy. Fiona also leads in freight work for Steer, has more than 15 years experience in researching, implementing and evaluating transport plans and initiatives which encourage the best use of the transport system's capacity, and helps to create more livable communities and places. And in particular, thinks hard about the details of how everything gets to us from where it started, whether it's an Amazon package or a baguette, she said in her bio. And she recently advised the National Infrastructure Commission on their Future of Freight study, and has worked with a variety of public and private sector clients on how to make freight and servicing activity more sustainable, safer, and more efficient. So, Ian, without further ado, let's hand over to you. I think you and Fiona are going to speak for maybe 25 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions from the audience based on what you've told us.
Thanks, Ben. Hopefully everybody can see this now. So yeah, as Ben said, I spent 18 years working in the industry. My planning degree is interesting, but I have never practiced planning in anger, so that's probably worthwhile considering. Throughout this, there's a number of pictures that I've included. You'll see, yes, you may be able to tell where it is, or obviously some of the companies. No slight is intended on any of it. It's just to try and use examples to explain what I'm talking about. So Fiona and I are both going to talk to you today, starting with sort of what is urban freight, some of the impacts, some of the challenges. And to just sort of think about things at the individual level, I can start by talking bananas. Purely because, each supply chain is unique, and how we get urban freight, whether it's delivered to us, whether we go and collect it from a shop or a supermarket, each thing is individual. So according to Tesco's this month, Tesco's, any other supermarket may also be available, from a range of different countries, and they reckon they're about 16p each. If I wanted to go down to the store in Sevenoaks as an example to pick them up, I've got to go through a fairly interesting series of locations to get these bananas to me. So for 16p, it's come from Colombia, for example, it's gone via Portsmouth Harbour, it's gone via Basingstoke, it's gone via Snodland, which is near Maidstone, and then it's gone to Sevenoaks. And I then got and picked it up. So you think about how many different road trips there are in there to move bananas. And they're a particularly unique commodity because they're picked green and they ripen off the tree. So that's just one. So when we look at the whole system of what's happening, it's an incredibly complex, multi-leveled setup. We're talking deliverers, collection and servicing. Deliveries are all very well, but you need the waste collected and servicing of properties, whether that be business or commercial or residential. Different commodities, and clearly you can't put concrete or hospital suppliers on the same truck as you put bananas. So multiple origins, destinations, local, national, international. We may get it from the final mile, the last mile being local, but it's a lot more complex. Different vehicles, from HGVs down to bikes and on foot, and clearly specialised vehicles for certain things. Concrete mixers, bizarrely, are only ever maximum 50% full, because they go out full, they will go back empty. You're not going to take concrete back to the yard. So some of this is about what exactly is moving and when. Whilst sea freight, ships moving stuff on boats, very sustainable in comparison, 90% of what we're doing is on the road network. We could talk about air freight, could talk about rail, but I'm going to focus on the road network because we're talking urban and most of it is on the roads. And most of those deliveries occur across the curbside. So the interaction with taxis, pedestrians, cyclists, bus networks becomes incredibly important as to how efficient those deliveries are to the industry, but also how to deliver the actual, mobility of people that we're trying to deliver with smarter cities. Unlike passenger transport, a lot of passenger transport that's within the remit of local authorities, the business of freight is commercial. It is customer driven, because if the customer doesn't order it, nobody's going to move any of this stuff in the first place. And because it's commercial, it's about what cost is it involved against what service levels you achieve. And that becomes critical, and I'll keep coming back to that. So to get a flavour of what that means across a particular supply chain, so from factories through to the customers, it's a range of different vehicles that we can use. If we want to move it by road, we can use an articulated heavy goods vehicle, rigid, van, cargo bike. And they've obviously got different weights, so they've got different impacts on the road, the physical infrastructure of the road themselves. Clearly, there's a difference in terms of if there's an incident between one of these vehicles and another road user, there's going to be a right difference between what you get if you've got a 500 kilogram cargo bike against an Arctic vehicle. There is bound to be a difference. But the reason that people use these within industry is because they carry so much more. For employing one driver, if I've got a fixed asset, I can basically shift 24 pallets. Whereas if I've got a cargo bike, yes, it may be a closer, it may be a shorter trip, but I can't shift the same volume of stuff. And when I think about how much I'm paying for the variable element of this, it's about the driver and it's about the fuel. So if we look at what outcomes we want from towns and cities, local authorities, whatever the authority is, with mayoral or whatever level we're at, we're really talking about reducing emissions, improving air quality and the decarbonisation, improving safety and livability, reducing congestion, and as I note this morning from the outline from the Mayor of London, improving the economy. Normally not mentioned quite so clearly, but no politician will ever want to make the economy worse. Operators, it's about the profitability, because otherwise, why am I doing business? It's commercial. And it's about customer satisfaction, because I want my customer to keep coming back. Now, clearly from that, it looks like there's very little in common. However, think about what's happened over the last few years, what's happened in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the climate crisis, global uncertainties. Those things are common. Everybody's impacted by those. Whilst in the local authorities, the local politics and the local political cycle that may be influencing things, the operators have had a huge shift in terms of us as digital consumers and retailers offering sort of quotes immediate or free delivery, neither of which exist, but there's a whole series of reasons why. Far too long to go into. The important thing is actually in all of that mess, there are some very common similar issues, partly because journey time reliability, the congestion factor is absolutely key to freight. Customer satisfaction is only going to be achieved if people deliver on time when they say they're going to deliver. The other side, the safety and livability, apart from the pure emotional angst throughout the whole system, if there are problems, most drivers, most people, most warehouse operatives are living in towns and cities. They want their location to be as nice as anybody else does. So part of this is about what we want as society rather than necessarily perceiving all the differences. So different ways have been looked at how we come up with livability and how we impact streets and places. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter what approach people look to try and move to. We know that what we're getting is potentially better places and we're getting higher spends. You know, the work that was done at TfL 14 years ago, I think it is, but you know, clearly there's an economic benefit of doing some of this stuff. But the issue with that is if we're going to actually have more deliveries, how is that delivery taking place? What's the routes and what's the access at the curbside? Where are the local logistics facilities and what regulations actually control it? So where we plan for freight, freight will behave, if you like, it will do what it needs to do. So on the left-hand side, we've got a vehicle delivering potentially to a pub. Lo and behold, why is he parked there? Well, because that's the cellar hatch. That's where deliveries go into that pub. You know, the fact that this is a timed location by looking at the blips on the road, we know he's actually doing potentially what he should be doing. He might not be, but I would guess that he is because when I take the photo. On this one, on the right-hand side, clearly a loading bay is being put in as part of a new scheme, and it's being nicely used by the van. You may also notice there's a car that's sneaked in behind him. The van could have moved further forward, which would have been useful. Therefore, this car wouldn't actually be overhanging the end. However, what happens is a lot of the time we end up with things whereby somebody's put in something and it's just not enforced. And this happens. Most of these photos are from London, but I can find places like this anywhere. And the other side of it is sort of fairly classic. So this is a development up in on the right hand side. We've got a development up in Camden, which is student accommodation above actually a freight depot. But because the students are getting all the deliveries, this DPD driver obviously didn't have a clue where to park. It's raining, which you may be able to tell. This is clearly not what we need. We need to make sure that not only does the location have somewhere to park, but the driver knows it as well. And the impact at the curbside, this is one that I know it's a pain sometimes people present with animations, but just bear with me on this. You've got fewer places to stop. You've got longer distance to move to the delivery point, which means that vehicle is going to be at the curbside for longer. That means he's going to get fewer drops per shift. I'm saying he could be a female. Most of them are drivers, are male. However, reduction in efficiency. So that reduction in efficiency of those fewer drops per shift means there's actually increasing operator costs and increasing price for customers. But the other side of it is the operator has to put on more vehicles. And that means fewer places to stop. It also means the air quality is probably decreasing. It probably means the safety is decreasing as more vehicles are trying to go around the same area. And if you take just one sector of deliveries in London, the brewery logistics guys, So delivering to the pubs and clubs with beer in kegs, they're saying they've had to put on 20% more vehicles since 2019. So this is increasing because people are forgetting to plan for those stopping points. Cities change, and that's the important thing to bear in mind. You know, life moves on. We're constantly evolving. Takes a little while just to work out from that picture, but basically, you know, somebody used to deliver milk out of that place, and now it's a Pizza Express. There's a whole series of factors affecting the changing of even something. If I wanted to do something voluntary with an operator, if I wanted to change delivery time, I've got to look at all these different things. So if I was trying to deliver sometime into an evening, for example, yes, there'll be some curbside controls. There may be some planning conditions in terms of no deliveries after 7 p.m. If I'm in certain places, certainly in boroughs in London, there's probably stuff about alcohol licensing that says I have to deliver a noise report to say that I could do it quietly. There'll also be a difference between what head office has agreed and what the branch has agreed. There may be tenancy conditions. There may be sort of almost sort of individual conversations about, well, could you come in a bit earlier today because Fred's not in this afternoon? And the operator's got a whole series of regulations about what they can legally do. So, you know, operator licensing that controls, you know, hire and reward of commercial fleets through the legal processes, sometimes those are limited in terms of the hours of operation of the sites. So there's a whole series of things. And if you then put on top of it what happens in London, there's a whole series of regulations attacking or addressing particular issues. So as an operator, I want to change delivery time. I've probably got to work through all of those issues, even if I'm just ticking them off to say they're not an issue. On the long term, if we're trying to change stuff so we stop the problem occurring so that we can then get to work on some of the where the problems are now, there's some issues about the land use. We're in a commercial property market, and clearly, you know, nobody wants a big warehouse next to them. I understand that. But there's also changes happening to the high streets, and logistics properties and industrial properties are disappearing. There's actually been a lot of work done on that over the years in London through the GLA. But in lots of places, there's no safeguarding on those land uses. And this behavior of sort of logistics being B8 use class is almost impossible to get in if you wanted to do a micro hub or something. How do you get that in certain places? And if we need to get the land use right, we still need to remember that curbside provision. Lots of people are getting involved in trials, and trials lead to change. So, for example, improving cargo bikes is happening. However, Amazon can do it because they've got the dense network at a very local level. So there's always a reason as to why some of these trials work. Electric vehicles are increasingly available for big vehicles. Westminster's City of Westminster's refuse fleet is now basically all electric. You know, changes are coming. But each solution has a different problem behind it. So if we take those two, cargo bikes and electric vehicles, they're both good for different issues, but we need to think of some of the things that may fall behind. Because the electric vehicle is fully regulated and it's licensed and the driver's licensed and the operators are checked. With the cargo bike companies, the good guys are doing all the same things. But if you think about somebody like Zedify that's recently gone into administration, it costs a hell of a lot to conform to some of that stuff. And you compare that to some of perhaps the food delivery riders who we may all have had experiences of, you know, some of this stuff may not be there. And we need to make sure that we're making sure that what's coming is safe on our streets, regardless of what size. There's also something about who's got the power to do the change. Physically, the goods move in one direction. We're all aware of that from supplier to us. But the payment, we pay the supplier, and the supplier then pays the freight operator. So we need to think of where the money is and follow that power of procurement to make some of those changes. As Ben said, I worked for TfL for a period of time. I came across this over the last couple of years, which is a Freight in London report from 1976, which talks about route networks and overnight deliveries and electric vehicles and even shop to home delivery. But of course, it wasn't implemented. You know, politics changes and some of those ideas are never implemented. So one of these things is to try and pick up on some of this and start small and maybe move forward gently. And then there is no single solution. I know freight is complex. It will always be complex. But if we do this together and actually make sure we plan for freight in this system, we can end up with fewer emissions, improve road safety and less congestion, which will suit everybody. Some of that's about prioritizing it in new developments and new placemaking, I think, and it's about that right time, right place and the right vehicle. And with that, I'll hand over to Fiona.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to lead us through this section on what some of the opportunities are for managing freight better within urban areas. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So before we jump straight into what some of the tools are, I'm going to start with what levers we have to effect change with freight. So I'm focusing here on what the public sector can do to support, accelerate or incentivise commercial operators to make changes to their operations. So local transport plans are the opportunity to outline any specific schemes to manage and enable freight. However, it is rare that there are freight-specific schemes that need to go into a plan, and so more often they're an opportunity to think about the role of travel demand management and moving other vehicles off the network to free up the street space and curbside for essential delivery and servicing trips. A local plan is the way in which the freight sector can be allocated the space it needs to run efficient distribution operations. And it's also the way in which freight infrastructure like railheads or wharves can be protected through safeguarding, which is what Ian mentioned a moment ago. With development management, there's the opportunity to put in place controls on how new developments are built, receive deliveries and are serviced. For example, you can require that construction material is brought in by rail or by water if possible. And you can ask that deliveries are made outside of peak hours, or you could even mandate some form of consolidation. Moving up to the other side, the public sector can and should make the first move in trying to improve understanding of the freight sector. And there are a few different models for how the two can be brought together, but what's important is that the conversation starts and then that there's some momentum brought to tackling the challenges that they share. Local authorities can leverage their buying power on contracts by specifying that vehicles used for council services, like those for refuse collection, meet certain safety standards or are electric. And then lastly, local authorities can be influencers. So with their own fleets or through their supply chains, they can demonstrate their confidence in new technologies or fuels, and therefore encourage and support local businesses in making a positive change. Could I have the next slide, please? So that was an overview of the levers that the public sector has, and this next section is about what some of the measures are that they could put in place. So I'm quite an organised person, and so I like having structures and frameworks to guide my thinking, and so this 4Rs approach is one that I find helpful for travel demand management strategy generally, as well as in the freight context. And the idea is that you work through each of the R's in turn, always starting with reduce, and you think about what could be done under each of those themes to help you address the challenges or achieve the objectives. So the 4Rs in this freight version of it are reduce, so thinking about how the total volume and intensity of freight trips can be reduced. Remode, thinking about opportunities to remove freight from the road network to an alternative mode. And that alternative mode will obviously depend on the context and the cargo. Retime is about changing when deliveries are made so that you change the time that the delivery vehicle travels. So shifting the time of travel to the early hours of the morning makes for a more efficient journey for the operator, but it also means that you stop freight vehicles from contributing to traffic congestion during the normal peaks. And if you can reduce the number of HGVs that are on the roads at the same time as lots of cyclists and pedestrians, then that's a win too. Refuel is about changing from internal combustion engines to lower zero emission vehicles, and this is the last step in the hierarchy. So once you've done all that you can do with the other types of measure, you're then left with a residual amount of traffic that you need to decarbonise and make safe. And the next slide, please. So there's reduce, so you can make the system work more efficiently if you reduce the number of trips that are made and use the vehicles that you do have on the road more efficiently. And you can do this by co-locating different elements of the supply chain. So the example that I like to use is making the chocolate for chocolate digestives at the same plant or next door rather than another part of the country. Or you can reduce the number of trips to a building or a street through a delivery and servicing plan. But all of these opportunities to reduce the number of trips have an ask of the planning system, which is that they all still need suitable space near to the destination address to sort and consolidate those loads. Or in the case of the chocolate digestives, it needs the planning system to protect the land around the biscuit plant for other parts of the production process. Next slide, please. Thank you. The second opportunity R is R for retime. So freight can reduce its contribution and exposure to congestion and reduce its interaction with other road users by shifting deliveries to less congested times, so typically in the evening or the very early morning. And again, there's an ask of the planning system to help realise that opportunity, which is that quiet nighttime deliveries need to be permitted wherever possible. Still lots of examples of nighttime deliveries not being allowed because of concerns about noise to residents, when in practice there are lots of things that operators can and are doing to make quiet deliveries possible. Next slide, please. Thank you. The third opportunity R is to remode, so take freight trips off the road network and put them onto less congested networks. And this is where most of the visible innovation is happening with robots and drones and high-speed underground tunnels. So the options are to move freight off the road and onto pavements using droids or pedestrian porters. You can put it in the air with drones, you can put it underground with Hyperloop, or boringly, you can put it on a boat or on a train instead. And most of these solutions do have an important part to play in the future freight system. But again, I think there's still an ask of the planning system getting them to work. So in this case, you still need cross-docking space to safely and securely transfer your goods from the road to the non-road mode. Next slide, please. And then the final opportunity R is for refuel, so responding directly to the carbon and air pollution challenge all towns and cities are trying to tackle. So refueling in this context is changing to a low or zero emission vehicle so that trips are cleaner. And this can be for the whole journey where that's possible, but it's currently most likely to be for the last mile. So using an electric van, a cargo bike, or even pedestrian porters, so that's people walking, is much greener and sometimes more efficient than an HGV or a large van. And the planning ask for this one is again about making available or protecting the space that operators need to physically transfer loads from the larger, more polluting vehicles to the smaller, less polluting ones. Next slide, please. Thank you. But it can, of course, be difficult for planners and decision makers to know which of these approaches to use. Transport planners use data as the foundation stone of good decision making, but we just don't have the same data about goods movement as we do about passenger movement. So this means that we have a partial picture of what's being moved, when and why. And without that knowledge, it's hard to understand the demand management aspect of freight. So what proportion of trips could be switched to a different mode, retimed to avoid peak times, or even avoided altogether? However, I do sometimes think that the pursuit of the perfect data set about freight might sometimes get in the way of making do with the good enough data that we often have already. I think if we're focused on what it is we need to know, we can usually find a way of getting the answer. And so I think that there's much to be said for going door to door with businesses in a high street to understand their delivery and servicing requirement, and a lot that can be gleaned from just observing over the course of a day or a week how the curbside is used. For example, in looking at this picture, we can see that there are 3 vans, 2 of which are servicing and 1 is delivering beer. So it's not always a mystery. Next slide, please. And another factor which can hinder good planning for freight is what's called freight blindness, where the public sector has limited understanding of why and how to plan for freight, so then doesn't make freight aware decisions. However, I think that bringing people together and having conversations makes a difference, and the public sector and the freight sector can be brought together through freight forums, partnerships or freight councils to work on shared challenges and priorities. And Ian, who you might be able to spot in that photo there, Ian and I are working on a project with Transport for the South East, Transport East and England's Economic Heartland now to understand what a training package designed to improve freight awareness should look like. Can I have the next slide, please? Which is just the end. That's the end of my part of the presentation. So I think I hand back to Ben for questions.
You do, Fiona. Thank you very much. Fantastic, both of you. A huge amount of information in there. Some themes emerging for me just from the last 20 minutes or so. First of all, the freight and servicing sectors obviously do a fantastic job in getting stuff and services to us in ways that we don't really notice. They are operating in a very complex system of systems, planning, commercial, regulatory, economic, and so on. Those systems are all in motion, changes to the wider economy, changing to the physical characteristics of towns and cities, as Ian pointed out, in terms of what we think our cities should look and feel like. Crucial importance of planning for freight, both at a macro scale in terms of where we locate facilities, but also is there enough curbside space for freight deliveries? And then the importance of having at least better, if not perfect, data on the freight and servicing sectors and what they need in order to help us lead the lives that we all want to lead in a way that's sustainable and compatible with dealing with the climate emergency. So we've got about half an hour now for questions from the audience. I just wanted to start by asking quite a big question to both of you. The consultation for the Integrated National Transport Strategy closed on the 20th of February. This is the first such strategy for, I think, about 25 years. How confident are you, Ian, first you and then Fiona, that the strategy, when it emerges, will avoid the freight blindness that Fiona just mentioned? One would hope obviously that freight will be referred to in it. How confident are you that it will refer to it and refer to it in a way that gives it sufficient weight in decision making going forward? Ian, you first.
How confident? I'd like to think that there is enough understanding, certainly in sort of design process. I've had conversations with Active Travel England, and they're aware that effectively, if you don't design the new cycle lane, for example, with some freight bays on it, you're going to cause more problems. There's clearly the NPPF has identified freight in some shape or form for the first time, really, for quite a while. There's some understanding of it, but it's sort of tended to treat it as, large warehouses equals large data centers, and there's a very different energy demand, but also vehicle demand from those things. Integrating transport, there's a lot of examples. I think I'm hopeful, but I'm not confident. I think it's probably the polite way of putting it.
Fiona, how confident are you? Can we follow up with more confidence, or are you about as unconfident as Ian?
Probably in a similar position, because Ian and I talk so often that I probably kind of reproduced opinions between the two of us. I think there has been a shift within the last few years, certainly since the point at which I kind of started getting involved in the sector, and there is an increasing awareness. So I think if we can get something right at the kind of national policy level, that inevitably will have a trickle down effect into some of the kind of more micro level things that we've been talking about today. So I think if we can just get the awareness at the policy level, at the national level, then hopefully things will follow.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a question from Nina Smith. To what extent, what do you think about the potential for planning reform to ensure that where there is available rail capacity, a rail line and rail interchanges, that all new logistics centres or warehouses thereafter need to be sited where they can be accessed by the rail network? Obviously, that implies building additional kind of transshipment facilities, but to what extent do you think we should require new freight and servicing facilities to be rail network adjacent and rail network accessible? Fiona, what's your sense on whether that's would be a meaningful thing to require?
I think if you could require that with suitable caveat, so where appropriate, because I suppose rail freight is applicable in certain, and it's perfect at doing certain things, and it's a very good alternative to road in certain circumstances. I think having a requirement, I suppose we're talking about warehouses here actually, but so in that context, I think thinking about serving warehousing developments with rail sounds like a great idea. But I suppose the economics of how rail freight works is so kind of finely tuned, finely balanced that it's probably not going to work under each and every possible circumstance.
Great. Ian, what's your sense? What's the capacity for a bit more kind of mandated direction of new freight facilities so that they are?
I think there's a couple of things. Clearly, rail has over the previous 20, 30 years been very much focused on passenger movement. And let's be honest, it's a lot easier for a train operator to say the service is delayed because a freight train derailed than for any other reason. It's sort of a good excuse often. There's a lot of freight sites. If you travel by train at all, you'll see a lot of things like concrete batching plants and things where sand and gravel are traditionally sort of moved around, and some of those aren't safeguarded. So we need to make sure that bit is dealt with. And then there's some practicalities, because we're actually delivering more freight on rail at the moment than we were 5-10 years ago, partly because the supermarkets have picked it up for moving. I think Tesco's are even moving sort of like 150 miles ish. By the time you've loaded it onto a train, people tend to take the whole train. There's some issues with paths because you've then got to cross where the passenger paths would go. So it's about safeguarding the things that exist, and I think it's about identifying those sites that make sense for geographical spread of rail freight, because trying to get stuff down to the southwest, into the southeast, south of London, those things become very difficult because there isn't that strategic rail freight facility.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you both. So Ian, you mentioned the importance of protecting curbside space. Jeremy Drews raised the fact that obviously pavements raise quite interesting challenges in terms of they're very congested already. Obviously, pedestrians need to be able to make clear, safe access along them. How good are we at designing curbside space, like, for example, loading bays, so that you can combine the delivery and collection of stuff from the freight servicing sector with the need for pedestrians and other pavement users, people in wheelchairs, people with buggies, to use those footways safely? Can we do that well, and where have you seen that done well?
I think that there's an issue, because clearly there are a number of quotes disruptors in the market, and there's a lot of investment in the tech side of things. People like to look for new solutions, but we're still moving stuff, and even if we're not moving along the road, we're moving across the pavement type stuff. I think that's the balance. I think it's partly about 24/7. It's, as sort of Fiona mentioned, that the issues about sort of trying to change the time of a delivery. These things would move the freight delivery potentially out of the way where the customer's prepared to take it. But I think the thing of, we know currently that there are certainly the food delivery riders, which don't, no disrespect to them, because they're basically incentivized by speed, but they end up using pavements, they end up doing all sorts of weird things, wrong way down a one-way street and things. And that then really starts to mean that perhaps people who've got a problem with mobility really don't want to move on that pavement. So I think it's how we consider the whole. Clearly, some of the trials that are happening with like the droids on the pavement have been in very, very suburban areas where we've got pavements everywhere and everybody's still driving. So I think some of that is how we get that balance right. And the other point I'd just say is that anything that's automated on the road that basically is working on cameras, and pedestrians in the way are going to stop that getting anything like a reliable journey time. I think that's why everybody wants to stick it up in the air, but then we've got how much energy do you need to push something up in the air and deliver it, and have you got space? If you're living in a flat, there's no way you're going to get a drone delivery to your flat. But drone deliveries already work because prisons have got a huge problem with illegal stuff going into them. So,
Yes.
the innovation, there was always a reason why things innovate.
Brilliant. Thank you. Fiona, a question for you. So George Rowlands has raised the fact that assuming that we can kind of build and use at scale electric driven freight vehicles. I know there's the challenge right now about HGVs, but that raises some quite significant questions around the kind of logistics of charging battery powered vehicles as opposed to internal combustion engine powered, which itself raises some quite interesting questions around sort of logistics. The question is, how do we make sure that we've taken account of the refueling requirements sort of early enough in the policy process, and potentially is that one of our should that be higher up our 4Rs? Because if you can't work out how to fuel your electric vehicles, then it makes some of the other things you want to do with the Rs more difficult. How do we factor that in adequately?
Yeah, arguably it needs to be, well, how you are fueling your vehicle fleet needs to be thought about very early in, I suppose, like the planning process, not necessarily kind of measure implementation stage, which is what I was talking about. I was speaking with someone from RTPI this morning who was talking about the fact that the energy networks are increasingly wanting to lobby for local plan requirements to include the kind of refueling or the energy requirement of logistics networks. That isn't happening at the moment. So actually, this is an ask from the energy network providers, the DNOs, I think, to get that information at a plan preparation stage. So it's another way in which these different sectors need to be able to talk to each other better and kind of share understanding, share awareness of the different issues that we're trying to work out.
Yeah, and I guess that raises the critical question, kind of the intersection between, to your point, energy, transport, environment, planning, so that you're getting this kind of classic joined up approach. That's a great point. So a couple of questions here about kind of technology and data, which essentially are the same question but slightly different. But the first question is from Dick Dunmore saying, presumably each operator user their own IT platforms could better IT enable more efficient sharing of vehicles, drivers, and delivery rounds. And then Ibtasim from Morocco has asked, what's the potential for AI-driven predictive models to make freight logistics smarter, safer, more sustainable? So to what extent, Ian, come to you first, does technology, data, and particularly AI offer the opportunity to actually everybody make better use of their existing assets, whether it's the road network or vehicles or drivers, so that we're getting more out of the system we've already got?
Yeah, and so they basically, so if you've got a heavy goods vehicle, the drivers had a tachograph in the cab for decades. It used to be a little disc, and it used to get scribed, and then it had to be sent away to be read. It's now done digitally, but it's still analysed to sort of look at how the driver is driving in terms of safety, exceeding speed limits, anything like that, so they can pick up the driver. But they also look at how efficient the whole system is by pulling the a particular operator's data together effectively to look at where things can be done in terms of routing and scheduling. Big supermarkets use sort of dynamic scheduling anyway. You won't get the same delivery at the same time necessarily to some of the big superstores, because they'll make sure that vehicle is they sweat that asset to the absolute nth degree. The likes of Amazon are already using that sort of predictability, because that's how they've got local stocking points as opposed to the national stocking points. So if you order, a book that is in the top 10 bestsellers, it'll be at that local stocking point. If it's sort of, 6,974 on the bestseller list, it'll be somewhere in the center. And it's this sort of the big retailers, because they've got the big information, because they know the predictability. We were talking to an operator yesterday about sort of this week last year. Tesco's, when I worked for Tesco's for about 3 years, best weather forecast I've ever come across, because they knew when they needed, lettuce in the shop for the salads because the weather was going to get warmer or anything else. So some of that is already there within the existing networks. The issue is really about collaborating between operators. It's been tried in the past with various sort of, freight exchange points and things online. There's options now, and I think some operators are more willing to do it because the market just gets more competitive and more price conscious. But there is that sort of, commercial element of it that people sort of like to protect their own work. It does work. Some of the big suppliers like McVitie's and things have done it in the past.
Great. Fiona, what's your sense?
I think.
Yeah, great. Fiona, what's your sense of whether we're kind of maximizing the potential benefit of tech, data, and AI to get better use out of our fixed and indeed our human assets?
I think I'd probably agree with Ian in that it is already happening within companies. It's the question of kind of maximizing it across the piece, isn't it? And again, we're talking about data and using data that logistics providers have or have access to, and using it to assist public sector planning just yesterday. And I think one of the questions that came out from that was, what is the incentive? So if these logistics providers have this very kind of commercially sensitive information at their fingertips, why is it that they are then kind of linking in with other companies and kind of sharing this, well, potentially commercially sensitive information? And I do think that the public sector has a question to go away and answer. So what incentives can you offer to the private sector to share some of this information and to help kind of utilize it for better planning?
Brilliant. Thank you. Ian, you made the point that it takes an awful lot of cargo bikes to replace the load of 170 or even certainly 100% loaded HGV. However, there are still some last mile deliverers, we think, who are using vans instead of cargo bikes for that kind of last bit of a journey. What's your sense that as to whether we're making enough use of cargo bikes, given their relatively lower environmental impact than petrol diesel vans for those, particularly for those last mile legs of a journey? And is there more we could do to increase their uptake? Sorry, that was a question from Lee Gravenor.
As I think both Fiona and I picked up in the presentations, the issue is often about where can they actually transship the goods,
right?
And when can they transship the goods? There are a lot of central city locations, if you've got the density of goods that you're delivering, that you could do it, but you need somewhere to base bikes overnight that's secure, and you need somewhere to get those goods off of a bigger vehicle onto the bike. And those are the two things that really become an issue, because in sort of South London, Freddy's Flowers are around a lot. They're in a place on the back of the old Battersea site. Clearly, the land use pressure there is increasing because of the development of the power station and such like. Where I am in South London, just down the A23, there's a new development that's been done supposedly for urban logistics. But it's 2-story, so you've got to stick anything that you want to store up in a lift. And they've managed to put a 2.9 metre height barrier in front of the warehouse doors. And I'm going, well, how am I going to get the HGV in there to take anything out the back? The other side of it is, what price is the rental for that unit? Because certainly during the pandemic, there's a certain big international online retailer that I've mentioned earlier who said they were basically being asked for commercial office rental rates for, basically warehousing space. That is not how logistics works. It's been working on a cheaper rate, and clearly the logistics industry may need to shift on some of that to pay for the places in the right locations. But if you've got an empty old, I don't know, Debenhams or something, we can't convert that or back of that to warehousing because we need to change the use, and nobody will let us do it. Or you've got to go through 2 years of planning to make it happen.
Right. Great. Thank you. Fiona, we've focused this morning mainly on urban freight, but of course, urban freight journeys are at the end of interurban freight journeys. I was at an event yesterday about the Lower Thames crossing and the extent to which there might be alternatives to that project in terms of things like improved rail freight facilities. To what extent do you think there's scope for shifting freight from road carriage to either water or rail for the bits of the journeys that are between major conurbations? And obviously you'd need to end up with some sort of railhead at the end of your journey to move it onto a road vehicle. But to what extent is there scope for that, do you think, in terms of the mode shift between road and rail or water?
I'll go with water first,
Okay.
because I think that is fairly easily dealt with. I've kind of investigated this at quite a strategic level for a couple of combined authorities, and spoken to Canal and River Trust, who've managed most of the waterways, or the canal waterways within the UK, and they don't have enough money. Basically, they don't have enough money to maintain the waterways for any kind of freight use, so they're just maintaining them for leisure use. So I think when we look at places like Birmingham and go, there's quite a lot of water around here, could we use it in the way that it was built for? It doesn't kind of get beyond kind of concept stage. Rail is obviously, it is used quite extensively for the carriage of rail freight. I think there are questions around how you, there's a question around that has been asked here already about kind of the balance between the capacity that you use for passenger services versus rail freight services. There are also questions around how you protect the existing facilities that you have. So there is a fairly good network of existing rail served interchanges, but quite a lot of them have been out of use for several years, and it's about kind of bringing those back into operation or safeguarding them for future use. Particularly in the southeast, people are kind of looking and going, "Oh, that looks like quite a good site for housing," or various other uses. We don't have land in a completely abundant supply. So there's a lot of competition for these kind of good sites, which could be used to support mode shift.
Great, thank you very much. So there's a question here from Anthony Jones about service management plans. I'm not sure, Anthony, quite what you mean by that, but the question from Anthony is, what is the panel's view on how well service management plans work in reality, and are they worth the paper they're written on? Would you know what a service management plan was and whether it's very useful? Forgive my ignorance.
Yeah, I mean, there's construction logistics plans, and I think the wording of that's fairly standard. Most people seem to recognise that as part of the planning process. How does that development happen? There's various attempts at delivering servicing plans, service management plans. The basic principle is something about doing something about the actual buildings now they're up and running, or a particular street. There could be an individual building, it could be a street area, it could be a wider area. Certainly part of that is giving people a tool to try and encourage it, but there's no definition of some of these things, so they can vary in terms of what they are. The principle is somebody has to manage this, somebody has to be responsible for following it through. And I think sometimes, and maybe Anthony's view is that it's been produced but nobody's followed it up, and therefore what's the point of it? Sometimes we do a lot of stuff happens in logistics where you'll see a lot of PR about things, but you never see the follow-up of what actually happened. They've got benefit if they're managed, I think, would be my view.
Great. Fiona, anything you'd add to that in terms of their efficacy and their value?
Yeah, I think we've done several projects where we have done like kind of voluntary delivery and servicing plans with businesses, you know, in a specific area, and worked like kind of reasonably intensively with businesses or buildings or the developers to scope out something that they can work to. So it's about when we do it, it's about understanding what comes into that building, the building's function, how things need to move in and out, and yeah, what the business model is, and then working with the business to identify something that they could deliver. So I think when we go in and do something on a voluntary basis, where you've got the support of the business, the occupier, the developer, to manage deliveries more effectively, and they will be incentivized by things like cost or there's CSR requirements or whatever. I think on that voluntary basis, they can be quite successful.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, conscious of time, I'm going to ask you one challenging final question each. So we started talking about freight being fundamental and often undervalued or ignored completely. Fiona used the phrase about freight blindness. If you had Heidi Alexander on the call, what would you say she needs to do to make sure that, whether it's at national level, regionally, locally, or by individual site, that we allow the scales to fall from our eyes and lose our freight blindness? And what would you want to say to Heidi about how to make sure that we're taking freight seriously enough, given its significance in all of our lives?
I would say that effectively, if we're trying to get like an integrated transport strategy and do it as cost effectively as possible, active travel and that will never be linked into everything unless we consider the freight element as part of any new infrastructure and strategy, because rail, roads, freight shares the same assets basically as people movement, and without planning for one, it's a recipe for failure with the other.
Very neat, thank you. Fiona, what would your advice to the Secretary of State be?
My kind of hobby horse at the moment is encouraging people to think about distribution land or distribution accommodation as infrastructure, in the same way that you think about utilities infrastructure. So when you're planning for a new development, you're thinking about the corresponding distribution requirement, so that you then plan in the land requirement for warehousing or some of these railheads or whatever. That's what I would like to happen. Brilliant.
So thank you both very much indeed. I'm sure we could go on for hours on this topic, which is insufficiently often talked about, as we started by saying. What's come up for me is confirmation of the critical importance of freight and servicing for all of our lives, and the need to reconcile that importance with the other challenges we face, like the state of the economy and in particular the climate emergency. I'm really taken by your phrase, Fiona, of all of us collectively suffering from some degree of freight blindness. We don't really see the importance of this sector, and they do a fantastic job in helping us lead our lives despite that. The critical importance of thinking about freight and servicing early in decision-making processes, whether it's national policy through the Integrated National Transport Strategy, regional, local authority planning, or indeed in the design of individual sites and buildings, and the critical importance, therefore, of planning in the broadest sense around freight and servicing. We need to keep Fiona's 4 R's in mind, and there was something very important for me about the importance of kind of partnership working between operators, between the public and private sector, between the freight sector and the energy sector, to make sure that we get the best use out of our finite resources, whether that's road space, human beings, or our budgets. So thank you both very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we'll come back to this topic on another day. Thank you everyone else for joining the call, and thank you very much for your great questions. I'm sorry I didn't manage to get through all of them, but that was a really, really interesting hour. And as I say, I'm sure we'll come back to this on another occasion. Have a great afternoon and hope to see you all soon.